Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. Chair recognizes itself for an opening statement, and then when the ranking member, Mr. Keating, gets here, he will be, of course, allowed to make his opening statement, but we'll proceed at this time. The terrorist attacks in Paris last Friday remind us the damage a terrorist organization can do with even a little money. ISIS, however, is the richest terrorist organization in history. Last year alone, ISIS made over $1 billion. That's more money than some countries make in a year. Much of that money was made from seizing state assets, selling oil on the black market, and taxing people living in its so-called caliphate. Those sources of money are mostly internal and do not use the international financial system. But other sources of funding are more dependent on the outside world and may be easier to cut off. For example, ISIS made nearly $50 million last year from kidnapping for ransom. Some estimates put kidnapping for ransom as high as 20% of ISIS's revenue. ISIS is not the only terrorist group kidnapping hostages to make money. AQIM is said to rely almost exclusively on kidnapping for ransom for funds. This is the same terrorist group that attacked a gas plant in Algeria and killed one of my constituents, Victor Lovelady, after taking him hostage. From 2008 to 2014, terrorist groups made roughly $165 million from ransom payments. To try and stop this wave of payments in the last 2 years, the United Nations passed 3 Security Council resolutions condemning the payment of ransoms to terrorists. Our own country has a long history of countering this barbaric practice. From the very beginning, the United States has always refused to pay ransom to terrorists. Barbary pirates captured American merchant ships and demanded ransoms to release the crews in the early 1800s. Even then, President Thomas Jefferson refused to pay the bounty. Jefferson argued that doing so would only encourage more attacks. Throughout history, terrorists have learned to demand ransoms from those who will pay. I also want to recognize that this issue can be complex. We have the mother of James Foley here with us today. Mrs. Foley, I want to express my condolences to you for the loss of your son. I think it's important that we hear from family members of those who are kidnapped, so I appreciate, and the committee appreciates the fact that you were willing to testify. Terrorist groups have long depended on criminal activity. Can someone shut the door? Thank you. Terrorist groups have long depended on criminal activity for funding, including trafficking of cultural antiquities. ISIS is currently in control of hundreds of sites throughout Syria and Iraq. These sites are the cultural heritage of humanity, but ISIS sees them as a financial opportunity. Declassified ISIS documents show that the terrorists made hundreds of millions of dollars from selling these antiquities. According to some estimates, antiquities smuggling at one point was ISIS's second largest source of funding. ISIS is killing people with the money it makes from these artifacts while also destroying history. Believe it or not, there are some people who voluntarily give their money to these murderers. ISIS has maintained connections with wealthy donors for nearly a decade. Many of these donors are based in Gulf countries like Qatar, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. Between 2013 and 2014, ISIS received as much as $40 million from these wealthy benefactors. And ISIS is not the only terrorist group benefiting from these deep pocket donors who give money to terrorist groups. Wealthy individuals from these countries fund terrorists all over the world, including Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab. They set up charities and funnel the money directly to the terrorists. The government of these Gulf countries simply do not do enough to stop the steady stream of terrorist financing that seems to start from a handful of Middle Eastern countries. These private donors are just as guilty as the terrorists. Unless more is done, the governments of these countries are complicit in the crimes. These 3 sources of terrorist funding have given ISIS hundreds of millions of dollars in the last year. Cutting off even one of these sources could make a big difference. ISIS thrives off the appearance that it is winning. By cutting even a portion of ISIS's funds, we can challenge its narrative of victory. That will mean not only less money for the terrorists, but also possibly less recruits. More importantly, it would mean less victims of ISIS's barbaric terrorist attacks. We must use all the resources at our disposal to target every source of terrorist funding, no matter where it comes from. And that is the purpose of these hearings, to listen to these experts on this issue. I will now turn to the gentleman from Massachusetts for his opening statement, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for conducting this hearing. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. This hearing is on terrorist financing generally, but in consideration of the recent events, it's an opportunity, an appropriate one, to pay particular attention to ISIL. Friday's attack in Paris and the recent bombings in Beirut, the bombing, we can now say, of the Russian passenger Metrojet in Egypt indicate that ISIL may intend increasingly to attack targets outside of its bases of power in Iraq and Syria. And it's worth taking a moment to express on behalf of myself and I think the committee, our greatest sympathy for the victims and their families of those terrible tragedies. This worrisome development in the United States and our allies must endeavor at all fronts. It demonstrates we must endeavor in all fronts to defeat ISIL. In order to defeat ISIL, we need to continue to assist our allies militarily to roll back the territorial gains made by ISIL, and in addition, and not unimportantly, we must work to cut off ISIL's supply of money and manpower by more effectively countering terrorist recruitment, terrorist travel, and terrorist financing. According to a 2015 report by the Financial Action Task Force, ISIL earns revenue from several sources, including various illicit proceeds derived from the occupation of territory, kidnapping for ransom, donations by or through nonprofit organizations, support from foreign fighters, fundraising through the internet. One of the significant ways ISIL finances its activities is through the illicit sale of antiquities. ISIL is directly involved in the lootings of archaeological sites in Iraq and Syria, theft from regional museums, and stockpiling of cultural objects for future sale on the international market. Further, ISIL earns money by charging others for licenses, they call taxes, to loot archaeological sites, and by taxing traffickers moving items through ISIL-controlled territory. To date, ISIL has reportedly earned tens of millions of dollars from antiquities stolen in Syria alone. To counter this threat, we need to do more to prevent the theft and destruction of antiquities in countries like Iraq and Syria. We also need to do more here at home to ensure that the United States isn't importing stolen antiquities and financing terrorism as a result. I've introduced a bill, H.R. 2285, the Prevent Trafficking in Cultural Properties Act, that would enhance coordination and training within the Department of Homeland Security to stop stolen antiquities from entering the United States, and even more importantly, to investigate and then prosecute the smugglers, traffickers, and other criminals that participate in this illicit trade. H.R. 2285 was recently ported out of the Committee on Homeland Security, and I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan bill, which is aimed at stopping terrorist groups like ISIL from financing their murderous activities through the sale of stolen antiquities and other cultural property. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and learning more about different forms of terrorist financing, including antiquities trafficking, and how better to stop this illicit stream of income. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. The chair will now recognize members who wish to make opening statements for 1 minute each. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Cook, for 1 minute in his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is certainly a very timely hearing. I want to thank Mrs. Foley for being here. This past week, many of us gave speeches talking about Veterans Day and the sacrifice that so many Americans have given in wars, and no matter how you slice it, this is a war that we are waging with this group, ISIL, ISIS, Daesh, whatever you want to call them. Their tactics, there's no limits to them. And I personally think that many people in the Middle East, throughout the world, have gotten a pass on this. We know that there has been support of that through some nations in the Middle East, the Gulf states, a lot of money, all these different things that has already been mentioned by my colleagues. But without a doubt, we have to do something about this. And I think this, as I said, after what happened, it's the most timely hearing we could have on the Hill. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Chair wants to recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, and also recognize the work that he is doing on the issue of kidnapping of Americans for ransom. So, gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Poe. Thank you for holding this obviously important and timely hearing. Kidnapping for ransom, antiquities smuggling, and private donations represent an alarming and largely underappreciated source of terrorist financing that has largely gone unaddressed. Further complicating our counter-financing efforts, many of these transactions are conducted without reliance on the international banking system, rendering many of our tools, such as sanctions and terrorist designations, ineffective. In recent years, kidnapping for ransom has become an increasingly lucrative enterprise, with reports indicating that as much as $165 million has been paid to Al-Qaeda and ISIS since 2008 for the return of hostages. Unlike the United States and the United Kingdom, many of our allies continue to pay ransoms, resulting in a vicious cycle in which terrorist groups specifically seek out citizens of countries known to pay, resulting in more kidnappings. We must ensure our friends and allies hold government-sponsored ransom payments. Doing so will lead to fewer kidnappings while also depriving terrorists of a major revenue source. I'm pleased to be working closely with Chairman Poe to develop legislation to address this issue, and I look forward to today's witnesses, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman from New York. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership on this critical issue of terrorist financing. I would like to extend my sincerest appreciation to Ms. Foley for the courage that you have shown in coming before the committee today to share your story. Our hearts truly are with you and your family. The murderous attacks in Paris, killing 159 citizens on Friday, Beirut killing 41 persons last week, and the bombing of the Russian charter jet killing 224 innocent passengers October 31st, further highlight the fact that our current methods of preventing Daesh ISIL's terror financing are not working. It is critical that America and its allies have the necessary resources to cut off ISIL's funding from any source that we can. It's imperative that those who do business or provide funding to the Islamic State in any way are able to be accurately identified, and that we have laws in place to deal with them. I look forward to the recommendations of the panel.
Do any other members wish to be recognized for an opening statement? Therefore, without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. And also, without objection, all the witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of the record. I ask that each witness please keep your presentation to no more than 5 minutes. I'll introduce each witness and then give them time for their comments. Mr. John Casera is a former special agent to the U.S. Department of Treasury's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. Mr. Casera is considered an expert in money laundering in the Middle East and the growing threat of alternative remittance systems. Dr. David Weinberg is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he worked primarily on Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. His research in this area focuses on energy security, counterterrorism, alliance transparency, and human rights. Mrs. Diane Foley is the mother of James Foley, an American journalist who was kidnapped and killed by ISIS last year. She is the founder of James Foley Legacy Foundation to continue James's legacy of freedom and justice for those without a voice. And once again, Ms. Foley, thank you very much for being here today. Dr. Michael Dante currently serves as the academic director of the American Schools of Oriental Research Cultural Heritage Initiatives, which monitors and reports on the heritage situation in Syria and northern Iraq. He is a Near Eastern archaeologist with experience directing programs in Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Mr. Casera, we will start with you, and you have 5 minutes.
Chairman Poe and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. It is an honor for me to be here. Mr. Chairman, I have submitted a written statement. I would like to take just a few minutes to give a brief summary. Kidnapping for ransom is a crime as old as antiquity. Unfortunately, in recent years, terrorists and associated criminal organizations have turned to kidnapping as a relatively easy and lucrative source of funding. The United Nations estimates that approximately $120 million in ransom payments was paid to terrorist groups between 2004 and 2012. Some experts believe kidnapping for ransom is our most significant terrorist financing threat today. As the tragic events in Paris last Friday make clear, the United States and the international community are rightfully alarmed about ISIS. The terror organization has kidnapped multi-hundreds, if not thousands, of victims, including local Iraqis, Syrians, members of ethnic minorities, as well as Westerners and other foreign nationals living in the region. Some were brutally murdered to send a political message. Others were used to extract ransom payments. According to the Financial Action Task Force, in 2014, ISIS raised approximately $45 million from kidnapping for ransom. In fact, because kidnapping and associated crimes such as extortion have been so successful, it appears the average ransom payment is increasing. It is a vicious cycle. There is no doubt that ransom payments lead to future kidnappings, and future kidnappings lead to additional ransom payments. And of course, the ransom payments eventually build the capacity of terrorist organizations, which fuels additional terrorist attacks. There have been several United Nations Security Council resolutions attempting to curtail ransom payments into terrorist organizations' coffers. Despite the restrictions, the world has not stopped payment. Of course, the complicating factor is our humanity. It is difficult to turn away from the anguished cries of those kidnapped and the frantic appeals of their loved ones. Last week, a new book that I wrote was released, Trade-Based Money Laundering: The Next Frontier in International Money Laundering Enforcement. It is often overlooked, but the misuse of trade and associated underground financial systems are often part of the kidnap for ransom equation. For example, money and value transfer services are found throughout Iraq and Syria, including areas where ISIS operates. Sometimes they're called hawaladars. They're trusted brokers and have established relationships throughout the region. They operate on trust and secrecy. Hawaladars generally do not conduct electronic fund transfers as banks do, but rather communicate via email, fax, and phone with a local or foreign associate to pay or receive payment from a counterparty to the transaction. Eventually, brokers have to settle their accounts. Sometimes they use cash, sometimes the conventional banking system. But I want to emphasize, and something that is continually overlooked, and that is historically and culturally, in all areas of the world where our terrorist adversaries operate, trade-based value transfer is used to balance the books or settle accounts. So, examining trade records for invoice fraud and value transfer could be the back door into money and value transfer systems used by terrorists. Unfortunately, neither the United States nor our partners are doing this. Moreover, I can make the argument that if one includes all its varied forms, including underground financial systems, trade-based money laundering could very well be the largest money laundering methodology in the world. And unfortunately, it is also the least understood, recognized, and enforced. Yet, I'm optimistic. By using modern analytical tools to exploit a variety of relevant big data sets, I believe international trade transparency is theoretically achievable, or certainly possible to factor many times over what we have today. As an added bonus, cracking down on trade fraud could also be a significant revenue enhancer for the governments involved. In my book and written statement, I go into detail on many of these issues, and I provide a number of recommendations on achieving trade transparency so as to combat trade-based money laundering, underground finance, and terror. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Chair will recognize Dr. Weinberg for your statement.
Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you on behalf of the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance for the opportunity to be here today. I will highlight some worrisome weak links in America's efforts to convince our allies to target financial facilitators and private donors to terrorism who often go unpunished. I will also offer some policy recommendations to hopefully help address the growing epidemic of kidnapping by terrorists for ransom. While I will defer to others on this panel regarding antiquities trafficking, I would ask your approval to enter into the record CSIF's new report by Yahya Fanusi and Alex Jaffe on antiquities trafficking in financing the Islamic State.
Without objection, that'll be made part of the record. Thank you, Dr. Weinberg.
Thank you. Several of America's Mideast allies, namely Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, unfortunately pursue problematic or even adversarial positions over tackling private terror finance. Despite promises to do so, they have failed to effectively obstruct the flow of such funds and to try punishing its practitioners. In my written testimony, I note dozens of reported examples of such negligence. In many instances, these governments grant legal impunity to people whom the US and the UN have sanctioned on charges of funding al-Qaeda. In my written remarks, I also reveal detailed new indications that Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia have let their territories become major financial hubs for Hamas. To ensure that our government's terror finance sanctions list isn't treated in the region as a mere toothless piece of paper, the US should develop a broader range of options for when our allies refuse to do the right thing versus terror financiers. Congress can help sensitize members of the executive branch outside of Treasury to these concerns. When the US is absolutely confident that an individual who enjoys legal impunity in one of these jurisdictions is indeed a senior financial facilitator for terrorism, the US could privately and then publicly seek that individual's extradition. If that fails, the US could even consider capturing or killing them, as it does toward other terrorist operatives. Congress could help hold these governments responsible as well for extending such impunity by restricting trade in dual-use items, as suggested under the Export Administration Act of 1979, and by again amending the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act, so victims of terrorism and their families can sue foreign governments in civil court for letting terror financiers and other operatives enjoy local impunity. As for the vicious terrorist tactic of kidnapping for ransom, we should recognize that Americans are still evidently being held hostage by terrorists today. In 2012, Treasury described kidnapping for ransom as, quote, today's most significant source of terror financing, end quote. Now, the volume of that income has only increased since then. ISIS actually makes more money off of oil sales, but ransoms have helped it and al-Qaeda conquer that territory in the first place. The Obama administration announced a new hostage policy in June, which was mainly comprised of efforts to be more responsive and effective at hostage recovery. But there is little sign that this is being matched by efforts to decrease the money that terrorists take in from such tactics. Even though the New York Times, AP, Reuters, and the Wall Street Journal have described allied governments in Europe or in the Gulf as sources of such payments. Although these states deny paying ransoms, the Journal called such state payments game changers, which can fuel the growth in ransom payments and incentivize future kidnappings. Doha's reported role is particularly striking. In my written testimony, I compiled press reports of 15 different episodes within 3 years alone, in which Qatar is reported to have helped mediate hostage talks, typically with terrorists, and often in which a multi-million-dollar ransom was discussed or allegedly paid to the terrorists by Qatar. The US should stigmatize governments that pay state ransoms. Congress could require the administration to expose such governments in public, perhaps even imposing targeted financial sanctions. President Obama should also direct diplomats to prioritize convincing host governments in several key countries to stop paying such state ransoms, and Congress can encourage policymakers abroad to enact such prohibitions into local law. The US could also follow in Britain's steps, blocking insurance companies from reimbursing ransoms to terrorists, but only provided this can be done in a manner that would not impose an undue additional burden on hostages' families. Finally, Congress and the administration could consider starting a fund with seized terrorist assets to compensate kidnapping victims and their families for their suffering. The good news is that the US now has a plan to try and improve efforts at hostage recovery, and the proof will be in how well those steps are implemented. The bad news is that US policy is failing to deter foreign governments primarily our allies, from paying multi-million-dollar ransoms that enrich terrorists and incentivize future attacks. Our government needs a new strategy to address this critical part of the problem, and Congress can help facilitate that debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Weinberg. Ms. Foley?
Thank you. I'm Diane Foley, mother of American journalist James Foley, who was publicly executed by ISIS, as you know, in August of 2014. And I certainly want to say that our thoughts and prayers are with the people of France and who have suffered such tragic loss at the hands of ISIS. But we too, as Americans, have suffered from ISIS. Our son James was tortured and starved by ISIS for nearly 2 years, just for being an American. Our family's ordeal was made worse by our incoherent and often ineffective hostage policy. Jim was the oldest of our 5 children, born into a very average American middle-class family. He was well educated, holding 2 master's degrees in writing and journalism, but far more importantly, he was a man of service, teaching in our inner cities in Phoenix through Teach for America, and later in Chicago and Massachusetts. He was always passionate about those without a voice, be they hostages, conflict journalists, or disadvantaged children in our inner cities. In fact, his belief in human rights actually led him to become a journalist, so that we Americans might hear the unheard stories of suffering in conflict zones. In my opinion, our current American hostage policy has not changed. I'm very aware that our U.S. public policy is no concessions to terrorists, to include no ransom or release of prisoners. However, our policy also states that the United States will use every appropriate resource to gain the safe return of our American citizens held hostage by terrorists. During Jim's horrific captivity in Syria, our policy was interpreted to mean no concessions, no engagement with his captors. Since 9/11, our government officials have often mistaken no concessions for meaning no negotiations, leading to an inconsistent and often unjust approach to the kidnapping of our citizens. The hands of our powerful FBI were tied during the 2014 Syrian captivity of our son Jim and 3 other American citizens held by ISIS. I am told that our strict adherence to this policy saves lives by decreasing the rate of capture of Americans. But no one has been able to show me the research behind our hostage policy. In fact, it would seem that Americans are becoming targets at an alarming rate. I respectfully demand to see the proof that our current hostage policy is truly protecting Americans. It did not protect Jim, or Stephen, or Kayla, or Peter. In the last 18 months, these 4 Americans have been killed because our policy was strictly applied, whereas 5 other Americans, Casey Coombs, Sam Farron, Scott Darden, Theo Curtis, and Sergeant Bergdahl, who were negotiated for by us or others, have returned home safely. This inconsistent implementation of our American hostage policy is unacceptable. Additionally, I would have you gentlemen know that we were deceived as an American family. We were told repeatedly that Jim was their highest priority, your highest priority. We trusted our government to help him return home. During the brief month that Jim's ISIS captors reached out to negotiate for his release, our government refused to engage with the ISIS captors, leaving us alone as parents to negotiate for our son's freedom. 18 months after Jim's captivity, our family and 3 other families of hostages held with Jim in Syria were threatened by Colonel Mark Mitchell, member of our National Security Council, with prosecution by our government, although there was never any precedent. if we attempted to raise a ransom to free our loved ones. He also very clearly told us that our government would not ask allies to help negotiate for the release and would never conduct any military operation to rescue them. He made it very clear that our United States government planned to abandon these 4 Americans. Thus, it became clear that Jim, Peter, Stephen, and Kayla were considered collateral damage, and that we families were truly on our own. I had spent much of our family savings, quit my job as a nurse practitioner to travel monthly to Washington to beg for help from Jim, to the United Nations, countless embassies, and to Europe multiple times to speak to freed hostages, all to no avail. While our U.S. senators reached out to us and were sympathetic, we never even heard from our United States congressman. The Foley family did try to raise a ransom for Jim's release, in spite of threats of prosecution. But because we had believed in our government to help, we started much too late and were unable to raise the money to interest ISIS. The reality is that very few families would be able to raise money actually needed to free their loved ones. Our U.S. government also refused to engage at a high level with our allies, who also had citizens held by ISIS. At one point, there were over 20 Western hostages held together, and all of them were our allies. In the spring of 2014, a freed French hostage had very specific information from ISIS to negotiate for our 4 American hostages and the 3 British ones. But our government refused to engage with the French or UK to save our citizens. The result is that all the European hostages are now home, whereas our son, the other Americans, and British were brutally killed. Although we had specific information regarding the exact location of their captivity beginning in the fall of 2013, a military operation was not even attempted until July of 2014, after all the Europeans were safely home. We are sincerely grateful to the brave soldiers making that attempt, but it was much too late. In our situation, our hostage policy prohibited our government from interacting in any way with Jim's captors, prohibited even for investigating who our son's captors were. Had our government been allowed to engage the captors, perhaps vital intelligence about ISIS might have been gleaned. Our government's abandonment of Jim allowed their deaths to be used as propaganda for ISIS recruitment, thus strengthening and emboldening ISIS. It surely helped in their recruitment of other violent people who want to destroy us. As I said before, at one point there were more than 20 Western hostages held together, all of whom are citizens of our allies. All our Western allies valued their citizens enough to negotiate for their freedom. Had Jim been French, Spanish, German, Italian, or Danish, he would be alive today. You know, we form coalitions for war. Why did we not engage with our allies to free all the Western hostages? I believe that much stronger coalitions with our allies are essential to deal with the shrewdness and hatred of these terrorist groups. I fear that our posture of no engagement with Jim's ISIS captors led to our underestimation of their intelligence and their deep-seated hatred for the United States and our citizens. What if we had been shrewd enough to engage Jim's Syrian captors in the fall of 2013, to learn all we could about them instead of ignoring them? Is it ever wise to ignore enemies of freedom and justice? You know, Jim believed in America. He believed that our government valued him as a journalist, as a citizen. I am told he was hopeful until the very end of his 20 months of captivity. He and our family were truly abandoned by our government. how would you feel if one of your son or daughters had been in Jim's predicament and been treated similarly? 4 Americans were publicly beheaded. Where is our outrage as Americans? Here is an individual American citizen no longer valuable. Why were Jim and the other Americans in Syria considered collateral damage? If our United States of America truly wants to protect and prioritize the return of its citizens, if so, I ask you, esteemed members of Congress, to hold this new fusion cell accountable for the return of our American citizens, and to mandate a thorough reevaluation of our current hostage policy, to make sure that recent validated research is being done to ensure that our policy truly saves the lives of Americans. Thank you for your attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mrs. Foley, very much. Dr. Dante.
Thank you, Chairman Poe and Ranking Member Keating, for this opportunity to discuss terrorist financing through antiquities trafficking. It's an honor to be here among such esteemed company, but of course with a heavy heart and with very serious concerns. Since the outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011 and the sudden expansion of the so-called Islamic State, or ISIS, in 2014, we've witnessed the worst cultural heritage crisis since World War II. On a daily basis, cultural sites are being destroyed for tactical, strategic, economic, and ideological reasons. Antiquities and other cultural property are being pillaged to finance continued conflict and global terrorism. As an archaeologist who's worked in Syria and Iraq for the last 25 years, there's not a day that goes by when I don't anguish over the current plight of the Syrian and Iraqi people and the atrocities ISIS and other groups are committing. My colleagues and I at the American Schools of Oriental Research work closely with Syrian and Iraqi cultural heritage experts and other concerned parties who are daily risking their lives to save heritage from systematic campaigns of cultural cleansing. These brave heritage professionals understand the importance of ensuring a brighter future by preserving the past and cultural diversity. The current conflict in Syria and Iraq is a war over ideas and cultural identity that is rapidly spreading to neighboring countries. The project I direct, the American Schools of Oriental Research Cultural Heritage Initiatives, constantly monitors the cultural heritage crisis in Syria and northern Iraq, implements heritage projects in Syria, and produces reports and conducts outreach for the U.S. government and the general public. We've seen that most of the major combatants commit cultural property crimes, but by far, ISIS is our greatest concern. Over the last 16 months, ISIS has developed a highly organized approach to looting, trafficking, and selling antiquities and other cultural property for funding. ISIS also brazenly destroys heritage places to promote its radical ideology and gain media exposure. There's no doubt that terrorists derive significant revenue from looted ancient antiquities and stolen cultural property. Satellite imagery, in-country sources, and open-source information support this conclusion. Information in antiquities recovered by U.S. Special Operations Forces during the Abu Sayyaf raid in May of this year prove ISIS uses the illicit antiquities trade as an important source of revenue. To ISIS, antiquities are a natural resource to be mined from the ground or pilfered from cultural repositories. This criminal activity has increased as other revenue streams such as oil have been targeted through airstrikes or other countermeasures. Antiquities trafficking is difficult to target, and for ISIS and other extremists it has the benefit of rewarding collaboration with employment. Antiquities trafficking doesn't make as many enemies among the local population as other crimes, but instead it exploits poverty and hopelessness. Also, antiquities serve as instruments for money laundering. We don't know the total dollar values of the illicit antiquities trade. There are too many unknowns, but ISIS and other transnational criminal organizations certainly find it crucial to their operations. And the financial and cultural costs of the destruction are manifest now and will have a cascading effect for generations to come. The current crisis requires increased and improved capacities in the United States for cultural security and cultural diplomacy. We need a more proactive and nimbler approach that couples existing governmental and non-governmental capacities. High-level coordination would greatly enhance this work and would facilitate containing, degrading, and ultimately destroying ISIS and other radical groups and transnational criminal organizations operating in the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. Reducing global market space for conflict antiquities should be one of our highest priorities. Legislation is pending in the House and Senate that would help to achieve these goals. Ultimately, the best solutions for the current cultural heritage crisis in Syria and northern Iraq also contribute to alleviating the humanitarian crisis, promoting conflict resolution, strengthening counterterrorism efforts, and fostering peace building. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dante. Thank you all for being here today. I recognize myself for some questions. It seems to me, and I may not have all of their sources of revenue, but we've heard that terrorist groups will do anything for money. They will steal, like the robberies of the banks in Iraq. They will, as Mr. Cassandra talked about, I call that money laundering. I'm a former judge. I call that money laundering, what you were talking about, cooking the books on trade. They make money off of antiquities. They make money off of hostages, and they make money off of their wealthy donors who want to send money to these terrorist groups, and there are probably a whole lot more. Let me try to address a couple of issues. Mrs. Foley, you gave us some remarkable information, and if I understand the current status of American hostage law or procedure, the United States has always had a policy not to pay ransom. Now it's changed that the government won't pay money for ransom, but if families or individuals do, that law will not be enforced as to that payment. Is that your understanding of the current status?
No. Families, you know, in criminal activity, a family has never been prosecuted for paying ransom to criminals who have a loved one.
That's what I'm asking. So as far as you know, no family's ever been required to.
No, I know that because we researched it, because we finally realized we were on our own and we had to try to raise a ransom. But of course we wanted to protect anyone, you know, who would care to help us. So there's no precedent for that, sir.
So that portion of the law, as the President has said, is not being enforced as to prosecute families that
Well, it really was never meant to prosecute families. It was meant to prosecute any groups that might pretend to be a charity and instead give money to finance terrorism or something. It was never meant to be.
Was your son kidnapped for ransom, or was he kidnapped as a propaganda tool, or both?
That's a good question. Only God would know what might have been in their heads. He was a Westerner. They don't check passports when they kidnap people, sir. You know, he was obviously a Westerner. He'd been in and out of Syria. He'd been there over a year. More and more of the jihadists had come in 2012. Jim had made very good relations with a lot of the family there, was trying to expose the atrocities of the Assad regime. So felt, you know, protected. A lot of the rebels really welcomed journalists early on so that their plight might get out to the world. But some people...
He was used as a propaganda tool too, though, wasn't he?
I think initially they wanted to make money off of him.
Okay.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. The propaganda only came when our government would not engage in any way. Nobody would negotiate for him. No one cared. So they thought, well, hey, we can make a spectacle of this. We can really get a lot of PR out of killing these Americans.
Dr. Weinberg, let me ask you some questions about the Gulf states. I'm going to be real specific here. Probably going to hurt somebody's feelings in the Gulf states. We have a military base in Qatar that we use to fly aircraft in the Middle East when we are engaged in military activities in Afghanistan or Iraq. Is that right?
That is correct.
So Qatar helps us out with that. But we know that Qatar has donors there, wealthy donors, who give money to terrorist groups. Is that correct?
It's certainly been correct in the past.
Do we
There's
know who those donors are? Do we know their name, rank, and serial number, so to speak?
The United States has sanctioned a number of Qatari nationals.
What
as
does
well as-
that
yeah.
mean? Don't do this anymore? I mean, what is a sanction against a national in Qatar who gives money to terrorist groups?
That's exactly the problem, sir.
Don't do anything. Don't do it again. It's not nice.
And the problem is that the local government often doesn't do anything about it. In fact, I've seen not a single indication of Qatar prosecuting anybody and convicting them under terror finance laws that have been on the books.
Do we pay to have our military base in Qatar?
No, the Qataris pay for it.
Okay. So you think Qatar's playing both sides?
I think Qatar is absolutely playing both sides in this regard, and I think the United
So they
States
harbor
couldn't-
people who
Yeah.
give money to terrorist groups, but they also have a military base where the United States can go and attack terrorist groups.
Yes, and individuals the United States has sanctioned live just down the road from where this U.S. base is, and if the United States chose to do so, it would not be too difficult to launch airstrikes if we were convinced, or conduct some sort of operation.
You mentioned that the United States has the authority to go after these people who are contributing to foreign terrorist organizations.
If it chooses to use that capacity, it's hard to envision.
To your knowledge, this is my last question, to
Please.
your knowledge of those different, I have two questions.
Yeah.
How many people are we talking about that are contributing money to terrorist groups?
The people sanctioned in Qatar, you can count them on a single hand.
It's not very many.
Yep.
And second, have we ever extradited, prosecuted, or taken out somebody who is giving money to terrorist groups, to your knowledge?
Have we ever prosecuted, extradited? Well, the United States sought to capture Khalid Sheikh Mohammed from Qatari territory in the 1990s. He was a senior al-Qaeda operative responsible for attacks linked to the 1993.
Did we ever get him?
He, according to former U.S. officials cited in press reports, a senior Qatari, either royal family member or government official, tipped him off, and he fled the country when we went to try and catch him.
So my question is, just answer the question. Have we ever captured, extradited, brought back one of these money bag guys who are giving money to terrorist groups to the United States to prosecute them?
Well, ultimately, we caught KSM himself, who was a senior money man as well as operational man, but we did it in Pakistan.
All right. Mr. Keating from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think one of the most important things any of us can do as Americans is to get to the root issues of what's going on, even though it's dangerous, even though they risk their lives doing it, and get that message out to the U.S. and the world. And Mrs. Foley, your son did that. And your testimony, I think he inherited a lot of his courage from his mother. And thank you for being here. I know that there's things we can do tangibly in terms of antiquities. I know there's things we can do in terms of trade-based money laundering. I know there's things that we can do to sanction some countries, but it's really troubling on the issue of kidnapping, ransom. Could you tell me a little bit about the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation that you're so involved with, Mrs. Foley? One of the things they do is hostage support. Could you describe what kind of work you do there and what the foundation is doing?
In truth, we're just beginning. Jim was very, as I said, concerned about people without a voice. So one of the big issues, obviously, I've been concerned about are American hostages. They end up in a truly gray zone. And gray meaning that nobody knew whose job it was to try to get them out. And no one really wanted to touch the issue. It's a hot potato. So one of the first things we've done this past year is we've raised funds for something called Hostage US, which will be similar to Hostage UK, which will support American families in this predicament. But the James W. Foley Foundation wants to go further. We want our Americans home. So whereas Hostage US, we're going to continue to support them because families need support, but I could have cared how I was treated if Jim were home. And I really feel as Americans, we need to be shrewder. We need to find a way to get them home. And I recognize that it's complex because we certainly don't want to fund terrorists, but is it wise to not even engage these people? Then we don't have a clue. We don't know what's going on. We don't know what they want. We don't know who they are. And, I don't think so. I just think we have to be a lot shrewder. Otherwise, we're going to be out of luck. So as far as the foundation, yes, we're working very closely with the Fusion Cell, and Lisa Monaco, Jen Easterly, trying to find ways to hold them accountable for, a lot of U.S. assets have been given now. 50 individuals have this mission to bring Americans home. None are home yet since they've been started. Granted, it's new. But I'm concerned because I think their hands are tied in a lot of ways. So that's one thing. The other issue is conflict journalism. These days, it used to be in World War II, journalists and aid workers were off limits. They had a certain neutrality. Not so anymore. I mean, journalists and aid workers are targets. And we have to be aware of that. So as a democracy ourselves, unless we come together for global safety for people who are giving us information, who dare to go where many don't dare to go, that is a huge concern of ours. So we're working with an international coalition for safety and journalism, and continue to be concerned about children without access to education, because Jim loved children. He really felt education was the only way for societies to get out of poverty. So we're looking at that.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I hope we can do is not have others experience everything that your family experienced. And as you go forward with the foundation's work, if you could keep us informed about some of the areas you think we can get involved with as you go forward, please do that. Feel free to do that, because I think we can certainly do better.
We better do better, sir. It's frightening if we can't do better in that regard.
And thank you,
Thank you.
for that. Another question for Dr. Dante. Just the May 15th raid on ISIL leader Abu Sayyaf. You call that a game changer at a certain point. What did we learn from that we didn't know before?
We learned that antiquities were very important to the organization, and they were the functional equivalent of other natural resources. There were emails, there were documents indicating that Abu Sayyaf had been put in charge of that trade because it was important to the organization. He was found to be in possession of hundreds of antiquities, some of them looted from the Mosul Museum, and he also had disturbingly photographs of other high-end items on his laptop. Some of those items we had been tracking are known to have been sold through Turkey.
Okay. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that briefly, but I'd say this, that many times in this very turbulent times, terrorism, we're so frustrated, we put up our hands and we can say, what can we do? I think you four as witnesses have given us things we can do to further fight this effort, and I appreciate it. And I think these are very tangible, real suggestions that can go forward on all fronts. Thank you. I yield back.
I want the members to know that we're in the midst of voting. We will continue after votes. We have one vote. But we will not recess until we have at least one more member ask questions, and then we'll come back. Apologize to our panelists, but that one vote shouldn't take a long time. Mr. Wilson from South Carolina.
Ms. Foley, again, thank you for your courage. And as a former reporter myself, so many points you've made that indeed in other conflicts, the journalists have been non-combatants. But it's such a chilling reminder that we're dealing with illegal enemy combatants not in uniform. This is just so, to me, so extraordinarily unprecedented and putting the American people at risk. And we're at a time, even today, within the last 48 hours, that ISIL-Daesh issued a statement that Washington and Rome are the next targets. So we've just got to be vigilant. That's why I appreciate the point that you're making, too, that where we all support no concession, no tribute, that doesn't mean not negotiate. So you're making a difference by raising these issues. And then it is appalling to me that there was not an effort of military rescue. Was there any reason, and particularly when you indicate that it was an exact location of 20 together? With that information, it's just appalling to me that that action was not taken. And that's one question. Then the next question, why was that not done? And then, with the attack in Benghazi, we're still discussing who did it. What? This should be determined. And then there should be efforts to find them. So on both, why was there no action? And what is the status of determining who these murderers are?
Well, those are all good questions. Questions that I truly don't have the answers for. All I know as an American citizen that we started to have eyewitnesses as of early fall of 2013, of exactly where Jim was. And our government knew that there were 3 other Americans and British with him. And we're quite sure that they also realized how many other of the allies were also together, because slowly their allies were negotiating all of these people out. Jim had already been held a whole year before all these other peoples were added. Jim was one of the first. Jim and British citizen John Cantley, and of course Austin Tice, who was taken in August of 2012. They were the first ones that I know of that were taken in Syria. But then gradually all these others were taken, most of them later in 2013. But the other European countries got right on it and started negotiating with the captors so that their citizens came out. As far as where they were held, we had information throughout, starting in the fall of 2013, and then again December 2013. They were moved, but because hostages started coming out in early 2014, we received very detailed information. As a matter of fact, it became clearer and clearer as the spring of 2014 went on, because these European hostages came out with very specific information. And some of them, one Italian citizen came to the U.S. twice on his own dime, trying to get somebody to hear the specifics he had in terms of exact location of where they were being held. But no one wanted to hear it. And this, particularly Federico, came more than any of the others. Some of the others hesitated to do that because their governments had figured out a way to get them out. So they understandably expected our government to work with theirs to collaborate, if you will, to get our citizens out. But it didn't happen, sir.
Well, and it's inconceivable with the released captives that there couldn't be an effort to determine who the perpetrators are.
Don't you think? I agree with you.
And so
I'm appalled as an American, sir.
Well, I want to work with our chairman to get this straight, so thank you very much. I yield.
Chair, we're going to now go to Mr. Higgins for his statement.
Thank you,
Our question, excuse me.
Chairman. Ms. Foley, in your testimony, you had indicated that you and your family were left to negotiate with your son's captors. With whom would you negotiate, and what was the nature of that
Well,
discussion?
the only opportunity we had, Mr. Higgins, was for a month in 2013, end of November. We, out of the blue, got an email saying that they had Jim, and they'd send us, they
they?
wanted some questions,
Who's
proof
they?
of life. Pardon?
Who's they?
They really didn't want us to know. They said they were Syrian rebels. They didn't identify themselves any more than that.
So they initiated contact with you and your family?
Absolutely. But it was through a very encrypted email that our FBI had no way of tracking. So they're very shrewd, sir, very shrewd. They knew how to reach us, but we didn't know how to reach them.
So you couldn't respond back?
Well, I could only respond through that email, but what I meant to say is we couldn't find out who was sending it. It was obvious that they were English speaking, however, because, you know, of the commanded language.
And was there specifics about a ransom number or conditions?
When they initially reached out to us, yes, it was ridiculous. Like it was, they wanted 100 million euro or all Muslim prisoners kind of thing. And, you know, FBI, you know, of course we right away sent it to FBI and they just said, oh, keep them talking, keep them talking. But within a few emails, when they realized they were just talking to the family, they had absolutely no interest. And so they cut off discussions. Until the only other time, sir, was when the French came out in March of 2014. They came out with another very specific offer to negotiate for all Americans and all the British.
And your primary source of contact in the United States was the FBI?
We had no primary source. I did have one, we had one FBI agent who debriefed me all the time. But
Briefed you on what?
Anything, I mean, I was talking to anybody, all the freed hostages that I could, et cetera. A lot of times FBI couldn't even get to them. So
At any point during your ordeal, did you get a sense that your son was going to be freed at some point, or?
not at all. However, our government told me, anyone I talked to at state or FBI, that Jim was the highest priority. So we were deceived throughout the first 18 months.
You never believed that?
Oh, I believed it totally, sir. That's
How long?
why we didn't try to raise ransom or do anything privately. Oh, we totally believed it.
When did you stop believing it?
By the late spring of 2014, when I could, primarily when Mark Mitchell threatened us and 3 times and made it very obvious that our government was going to do nothing for those citizens.
And what was the nature of Mark? What was his threat?
Oh, that first of all, as Americans, if we dared to raise a ransom to get our loved ones out, we would definitely be prosecuted. And secondly, there's no way our government would ever ask another country. You know, he was going by the law. And I know that the law says we're not, you know, we don't want Qatar to do these things. But what he was saying essentially is your government will do nothing to get your people out. Nothing. And he just said it in a very, I mean, God bless that man. Anyway, I don't know. It's just very appalling that as an American that we would do nothing for some of the best of America, some of our journalists, some of people who care about the suffering of the people in Syria. It was appalling to me, sir.
I have no further questions.
Thank the gentleman from New York. We will be in a short recess until the members vote and quickly come back, and we'll continue this. I want to thank the witnesses for your patience, but your information is so important that I don't want to end this hearing at this point. So we'll be in recess until, for 15 minutes maximum.
So we have to wait now? What are they doing? On something else, on another issue? Ugh.
Subcommittee will reconvene. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. Qatar doesn't just allow its citizens to give money to terrorist groups. Government money is going to Hamas and other terrorist groups. I think we have to get serious about this war. I'll give you some examples of where at least some of our friends are not serious. The Iraqi government pays salaries to former civil servants who live in ISIS-controlled areas. I do not remember General de Gaulle sending gold coins to French teachers in Normandy or Bordeaux. The oil fields controlled by ISIS, we don't bomb. We bombed World War II oil fields. We don't bomb these. Some say it's because the Iraqis want to get them back intact. Some say it's because the Iraqi government's making a lot of money on this war and doesn't want to see ISIS lose the revenue. But you have something which, by the definitions of the war we took most seriously, World War II, is a strategic target. We know that ISIS is pumping the oil. We hit their mobile refineries, but we won't hit the oil fields. We're not hitting the dams. We're not hitting their electric generation facilities. And I can't get a straight answer out of either our government or the Iraqi government as to whether Iraq is providing free electricity to Mosul. But the lights are on for, and they're not on all the time, but they're on for a reason. The biggest score, and I realize it may be slightly outside the definition of this hearing, although we do have the word donations in this, is ISIS got its hands on $500 to $800 million of Iraqi currency. Now, what other countries do, for various reasons, is that they issue new currency. You do a recall of the greenbacks and you issue bluebacks. Iraq didn't do that because that's a technique that is used to go after corrupt politicians and organized crime. And when you have a Baghdad government installed by us, protected by us, financed with our money, that is pretty dependent upon, infiltrated by, controlled by Iran, the Quds forces, and organized criminal and corrupt elements, they're not going to recall the currency. So as to hostages, we definitely should not do nothing. The raid didn't work, but it shows a U.S. determination. We need to sanction Iran for holding 5 American hostages. The president made it clear that the deal in Geneva related only to nuclear weapons. And if any other country was holding 5 of our hostages, we would certainly sanction them. Dr. Weinberg, does Qatar even pretend to outlaw voluntary contributions made by its citizens to Hamas? Is that a violation of Qatari law?
So Qatari law doesn't discuss specific organizations in terms of the legislation. They've had several laws on the books. One actually approved by the Emir this week, banning citizens from collecting money without authorization for donations. But this is
Well, that's collecting from others. What, is it illegal to just send your money directly?
Well, this is
Hamas, donation fund, care of, Gaza.
The Qatari government has given itself the authority to list terrorist groups or
Have they listed any?
Not to my knowledge. Of the 4 laws intended to combat terrorism finance in the country, the U.S. has yet to see serious convictions.
So it's
under any of them.
illegal to give money to anyone on the list, and the list is a blank piece of paper.
The latest law theoretically means that you need to get governmental authority to collect donations for anybody. The
To
question
collect,
is,
but if
hard to see it being
if
enforced.
Qataris see that there's a disaster in Bangladesh, and they give to the Bangladeshi Red Crescent Society or UNICEF or something like that, they don't need government permission to write a check to UNICEF, do they?
I think the most striking evidence in this regard is that the United States sanctioned 2 Qatari nationals in August, I believe, who, as I understand it, were running the most high-profile fundraising organization for Syria relief in Qatar. The U.S. alleged that they both were high-level al-Qaeda financial operatives. It took the Qataris almost a year after the organization was allegedly, according to the Washington Post, endorsed by the Nusra Front on social media for the Qataris to shut it down. And a year after that, when the U.S. actually sanctioned them, U.S. officials indicated the Qataris still had not arrested the 2 men.
Nor would we expect them to. I would point out to our friends in Qatar that just because you host a U.S. military base does not mean that the United States has to preserve your regime. We have a military base in Cuba. That doesn't mean we are supporters of the government in Havana. Our policy has changed from this way or that way, but it's nice to have the base there. That doesn't mean we have to support their government. I'd also point out, and with Mrs. Foley here, I feel bad saying it, but I don't think that we should be paying money as ransom to terrorist organizations. It from an emotional standpoint, you want to. From an emotional standpoint, it may get the particular loved one back, but it's just a while before they kill some other Americans or seize some other American hostages. And of course, with money that gives them both an incentive and a capacity. So I will yield back, and thank you for your time.
Chair recognizes Mr. Keating, Massachusetts.
That's okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question about the nonprofits again, not just Qatar, but particularly Mr. Kassar, Dr. Weinberg. What other nonprofits are there in the world? What are some people donating unwittingly, not knowing where some of the money is going? Are we able to do this? If you could just enlighten us on some of those sources of financing that the terrorists get.
So this has been a long-standing practice among financiers of financial operatives for al-Qaeda for years, which is basically, well, we can't openly practice what we do in many regards, so let's cloak it in a veneer of charitable relief. There's a particularly noteworthy case in Kuwait as well. There was a fundraising outfit operated by an individual named Hajjaj al-Ajmi, which was presenting itself in most of its presentations as relief for the Syrian people, support for legitimate resistance, but in practice, according to what the U.S. government has designated, he was basically funding al-Qaeda in very large amounts. Since then, he has been called in for questioning by Kuwaiti authorities.
Are donors aware? Are some of them innocently being?
Some of them are innocently being exploited. There are his tribe in Kuwait, as well as another tribe, have been exploited by people trying to play on their sympathies. The challenge is that once these sorts of frauds are exposed, the penalties are inconsistent at best in some of these places. And so the United States can work to try and build leverage to motivate the host governments to act, because apparently so far they don't seem to be sufficiently consistently motivated.
Yeah, and I imagine if you just go with a nonprofit name and not the people behind them, sort of like whack-a-mole, because they can do this and start another.
Exactly. In that instance, one of the individual is under sanctions, but his co-captain in one of his main fundraising networks is still a senior operative in a Kuwaiti political party.
Dr. Dante, just quickly, I'm curious too with the passageway for the Antiquities. What are some of the transit countries involved? What's being done there? And are they following the same routes of other criminal illicit activity like drugs or money laundering? Are there parallels? And how can we? I think we can do things here at home to tamp down on demand. I've talked to people in the UK, similarly motivated to do that in terms of final destinations. But what about the transit countries rather, and what can we do to disrupt that chain?
Right. So in the cases that we've seen, over the last 16 months, the primary trafficking points for antiquities coming out of Syria were Lebanon and Turkey. And from that point, much of the material was going to Bulgaria and Greece, and then with the objective of moving the material into the Schengen zone, the free border zone. Those are the cases that we were looking at. There were allegedly routes taking material to Jordan, Israel, and the Gulf as well. Since, let's say, October, some of those routes have shifted as the Turks have taken military action. Some of the border crossings that Islamic State was using have fallen to YPG or Turkish forces. And we see initial indicators that some of the Sunni Arab and Islamic State, ISIS, trafficking is moving now towards Lebanon. There's been a shift in the markets there, presumably to take the material from Lebanon to either Cyprus, Greece, or Bulgaria. I would say that in terms of trying to shut that trade down, what could be done is to limit the number of ports that are involved in the illicit trade in antiquities, and also to limit the number of people who can legally import antiquities.
Are they following other illicit activities like drugs or money laundering, any of those?
Yes, in looking at the routes that the material was taking through Turkey and Bulgaria, it was following a lot of other contraband out of the country. For example, stolen automobiles, other stolen capital goods, and following the routes that Islamic State fighters, were entering the country through, and in illegal weapons. The same border crossings, for example, the Tel Abyad-Aksakala border crossing that ISIS told its would-be migrants to use to come and join the caliphate, in a PDF that was posted online. And satellite imagery, in-country sources indicated that that was a route that the antiquities were leaving the country from, to ports in western Turkey. And it's in southern and western Turkey where Islamic State essentially is surely alighting with or joining up with organized crime units within Turkey to move that. Islamic State is essentially new management taking advantage of existing looting networks and existing trafficking networks that predate the conflict period. And they've essentially just encouraged additional, far more looting and trafficking of antiquities. But these routes existed in the pre-conflict period. So
just quickly, any human trafficking involved in that?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kidnapping for ransom has, become a significant source of terror financing. In 2003, Al-Qaeda would get about $200,000 per hostage. Now they're getting about $10 million. Over half of Al-Qaeda's operating revenue comes from ransom from kidnapping. But ISIS seems to be different. ISIS seems to be involved in other activity. And a lot of their ability to raise funds is locally, terrorizing the local population, taxing people. Every activity that's done there is taxed and results in a revenue source for ISIS. Any thoughts about that distinction and what is gleaned from it? Anybody on the panel?
So I think it's certainly important to contextualize this, like you said, and to say that the primary sources of revenue that ISIS in particular have are derived from control of local territory. I think it's also important for us to recognize that treasuries indicated ISIS, as well as branches of Al-Qaeda in Yemen and North Africa, have been able to conquer territory, in part because they've used private donations as well as ransoms to fuel and to fund that territorial conquest, particularly as the United States and our allies work to cut off their income from oil smuggling and from their ability to even hold territory in the first place. They're going to fall back on these other sorts of revenue as well. And so if we really want to conquer this phenomenon, we need to address this. We've also learned that ISIS and Al-Qaeda frequently will use these private donations and other sorts of external funding to particularly pay for moving recruits from other countries, which they've done in the tens of thousands, to battle zones. And so if we can cut off these two other sources of funding, we may be able to limit the ability of the organization to function, even if it still has other sources of revenue.
it's not only sources of funding, it's laundering money. I'd just like to share a quick anecdote. About 2002, not too long after 9/11, I had a conversation with a Pakistani gentleman who I guess you could charitably describe works in the gray markets. And I was talking to him about things we're talking about today. I was talking to him about trade-based money laundering, over and undervaluation, hawala, the misuse of the Afghan transit trade, et cetera, et cetera. And he finally turns to me, he says, Mr. John, he says, don't you know that your enemies are transferring money and value right under your noses, but the West doesn't see it? Your enemies are laughing at you. And I think that kind of encapsulated a lot of what this issue is all about. We've spent an incredible amount of time the last 14 years since 9/11 looking in many of the wrong places. We've been concentrating on financial intelligence, setting up financial intelligence units, filing suspicious activity reports, sanctions and designations. We're a nation of laws. Our adversaries, the terrorists, they're not. They're laughing at us, okay? We need to start thinking how they operate, all right? We need to understand their cultures, their methods of doing business, their values. We're making progress, but it's taken far too long. I think we're kind of emphasizing the wrong things. Just an observation.
I would concur with that in a big way. I mean, I just feel that they have the upper hand because they are shrewder. They have studied us. They know how to use Twitter. They know how to use PR, video, etc., to get their message, to recruit people who hate us. And we won't even talk to them. I mean, we've got to know our enemies. We've got to use our cultural expertise to really get serious about engaging with us. And, I mean, that's why, I realized Jim was just a young American, but our FBI and state didn't use that situation with 4 Americans being held there to find out who are these people that are holding on to our Americans. Why are they holding on? What do they want? They didn't even try. And how are we going to understand, engage this enemy if we don't even try to know them? Thank you.
Yield back.
Chair recognizes itself for a few more questions in closing. In addition to the list we started out making about where terrorist organizations get their money, we have to now add wildlife poaching is another way they get their money. And as my friend from New York mentioned, human trafficking. They make money off of human trafficking as well. And charities. Let me ask you something, Dr. Weinberg. You mentioned specifically about charities in other countries. Do we have charities in the United States that are not really charities? They're just a front for money laundering or donations that go to charity but ends up in the hands of these bad guys?
Yeah. The most recently, U.S. law enforcement authorities, I believe, pressed charges against a network of several Yemeni nationals who were using illicit methods within the United States to fundraise for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, including defrauding credit card companies, taking out money and then closing down the accounts. Also, if you look back historically, Hamas used U.S. territory quite deftly in methods that were exposed during the Holy Land Foundation trial, and many of those individuals have gone on abroad, people who are linked to the Holy Land Foundation, to continue to be parts of Hamas's regional financial network, including one case I identified in my written testimony.
And once again, the handful of individuals who do most of the contributing to foreign terrorist organizations, giving them money, we know who those people are. Is that right or not?
Sometimes.
We know who some of them are.
Right. Part of the challenge is that the donors are often harder to track down than the operators themselves, right? If you look at it almost as a pyramid or something.
I understand.
Right. But
like in a drug
trafficking,
we get the guy who's selling drugs on the corner. We don't get the guy who who's bringing it into the country or making
Exactly.
it, making
But the
money.
more we can take out the operatives in the middle, the people at the bottom of the pyramid are more prone to sting operations and things like that.
And Mr. Casera, going back to your comments, United States has a financial investigation of money going from banks to banks, trying to track it to see if it's legitimate or not. But your testimony, the terrorists don't operate that way. Is that a fair statement? They operate through trade, and how much illicit money have they been making with the money laundering through trade that you discussed?
First of all, I'd like to explain that, as we've talked about here today, terrorists, our adversaries, they diversify, just like any criminal organization does, just like a good investor does, if you will. You don't put all your eggs in one basket. They diversify. So they use a wide variety of funding methods and laundering methods. Yes, they use banks. They do. But I think there's been an overemphasis on us targeting Western-style financial institutions. In effect, we're still fighting the war on drugs, where large amounts of dirty money sloshed around through Western financial institutions. In fact, our anti-money laundering countermeasures were put in place, a generation ago when we were fighting the war on drugs. We have to be a little bit more nimble right now. Yes, I believe trade is a huge issue. The Financial Action Task Force calls it one of the 3 largest money laundering methodologies in the world.
How much money are we talking about?
You're talking the magnitude of money laundering in general, according to the International Monetary Fund, is about 3 to 5% of the world GDP. Or roughly speaking, very rough numbers, say $5 trillion a year, okay? Roughly the size of the U.S. budget.
Give or take $1 trillion or $2 trillion.
Give or take $1 trillion or $2 trillion. You're talking real money here. They further think that is about equally divided between talking suspicious activity, SUA, suspicious unlawful activities, predicate offenses to charge money laundering. The criminal side, fraud, antiquities, smuggling, human trafficking, narcotics, etc., and tax evasion. So it's about equally divided. Say it's $4 trillion a year, about 2 tax evasion and about 2 traditional criminal predicate offenses. How much of that involves trade-based money laundering? My personal opinion is, and I detail that in this book, is that is the largest money laundering methodology in the world. But we don't know because it has never been systematically examined. We haven't done it in the United States. Our Department of Treasury has never taken a look at it. I mean, the Financial Action Task Force did a money laundering methodology back about 2006, and they kind of threw up their hands. But it's not a solvable problem, but it's something that we can do a great deal more to combat because the data exists. In many hidden money laundering systems methodologies out there today, say, for example, bulk cash smuggling, it's very, very difficult to follow that trail. But this type of thing has data. And with modern analytics today, we can do a much better job.
All right. I want to thank all 4 of you for being here. You want to ask some more questions? Yeah. Mr. Sherman?
I just want to bring to the attention of the subcommittee, it's not just Qatar that takes a blind eye. It's also the U.S. government. I brought to the attention of both the Attorney General and the IRS the fact that there's a group based in Britain called Viva Palestinia that gives money to Hamas. Now, you got to understand that in liberal circles, it's kind of, in very liberal and leftist circles, it's kind of acceptable to give money to Hamas. It's not Al-Qaeda, not ISIS, but Hamas, okay. And so brought to their attention that Viva, and then the website of the Interreligious Foundations for Community Organization that said, we'll help you get a tax deduction for giving money to Viva Palestinia so that they can give the money to Hamas. Brought this to their attention. Not only was there no criminal action taken, but after 5 years, there's just a review of the interreligious foundations. And if there's anybody in this room who wants to get a tax deduction and give money that they can be certain will go to Hamas, the website's available to you right now. So I know we're the International Affairs Committee, and we criticize a lot of foreign governments. Our own is in this. Now, I will say this. The IRS has published the fact that they are doing a study on this. And they may eventually turn to the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization, in spite of the fact that it has the word organization, interreligious in it, and deny their 501c3 status. Maybe. By then we'll see peace in the Middle East and Hamas won't be a problem. Second, on cultural awareness, I know Mrs. Foley brought that up. I've been on, the double entendre would be I've been on a jihad to get the State Department to hire just a few people who are hired not because they can pass the Foreign Service exam, but because they are real experts in the theology and jurisprudence of Islam. Because you do have to understand not just your enemy, but the group that we're trying to win over, which is the 1.2, 1.3 billion Muslims who ISIS would like to win over to their side. And they're pretty rigid over there. You know, if you go to Princeton, they'll hire you. But if your knowledge, if you reach one of the highest levels of knowledge in the theology and jurisprudence of Islam, they won't. And so their arguments are basically to tell people ISIS is bad because they kill women and children, Yazidis, without being in a position to argue as to whether to deal with the argument from ISIS that, well, that's a good thing. Look at their twisted interpretation of Islamic jurisprudence and theology. So, just while we criticize other governments, we've got a government that will still to this day give you a tax deduction for giving money that you can know goes to Hamas. And we do have some people in the State Department that know some things about Islam, whatever you can learn kind of from the outside in a couple of graduate seminars. And we have religious Muslims, but they may be working on trade issues. There's no department there that says, here's how we can frame our arguments to Islamic governments based on a real knowledge of Islam. With that, I think I've gone over time. I yield back. I haven't gone. I'm yielding back a minute early. Put that on the record. Thank you.
I will put it down because that is a record. But I do want to thank the members of Congress. I want to thank you all for being here. I can't emphasize enough how valuable the information that you've given us is. Ranking Member Keating and I were talking during the break that we could have a hearing on each one of the issues that the four of you talked about because it's important information, and we appreciate the fact that you've been here and have given us this information. And once again, Ms. Foley, thank you so much for being here. I agree with the comment that was made. Your son probably got his spunk from you, that's a compliment, by the way. So thank all of y'all, and if you have any other information that you'd like to share with the committee, feel free to do that. Give it to me, and I'll share it with the other members of the committee. The committee now is adjourned.